Hello and welcome to your world of Reg. This is the part of the register where you get to vent your spleen and air your views. And we decided to bring back guest commentator Trevor Pott, our sysadmin from Edmonton, who we enjoyed so much last time that we decided to find out what's rattling his cage once again. Trevor, what have you been thinking about?
Well, I've been looking at VDI implementations and some of the different ways in which you can do it. When you go about and you read a lot of the articles, the register is really no exception. Everything is banging on about VDI specifically in terms of virtualizing entire desktops. And I think that a lot of the alternatives have been missed. There's a lot of room between the traditional desktop and a full-on VDI implementation of virtualized desktops that just never really gets explored.
So what are some of these different alternatives when it comes to desktop virtualization?
Well, if you go back in time far enough, you have good old-fashioned terminal services. Microsoft calls it Windows Desktop Services now. But essentially what it is multiple users running off of a single server. You install an application once on this server, and it will install it for all users. You patch the server once, and it patches it for all users. Now, the disadvantage to this is that if your applications are poorly coded, then one of your users happens to crash an application, and they may very well crash it for all users. One of your users happens to freeze up the server somehow, they will freeze up the server for all users. But outside of some fairly corner case software, most of those issues have gone away. Now, this has come halfway around again into what is called application virtualization, where you have a terminal services or desktop services server that virtualizes a single application and provides that out through a terminal services window. So as far as the user is concerned, I mean, they still have a physical desktop, a full-blown copy of Windows sitting underneath their desk there, and most of their software installed just the way that they're used to. But this one application that they click on happens to actually run off of a central server, because that's really the one application that you have to worry about centralizing, that you need to manage centrally, or that you feel you need the processor of a full server to deal with, and you just don't need to be running this off of your ancient desktops that you're really reluctant to refresh.
Don't all these other alternatives just muddy the waters? Why not just use VDI and have done with it?
Going for full-bore virtualization is in some cases swatting a fly with a nuke. You can actually make better use of resources in a lot of ways by using a terminal services setup than you ever could building entirely isolated, full-blown systems through VDI. You're throwing way too much processing power, too many resources, too much licensing at solving a problem that otherwise could be made to go away fairly cheaply and easily.
And yet you used VDI in your own organization, so explain how that decision was made.
Well, when we talk about one of those corner case applications whereby one user can crash the application in a terminal services environment and successfully crash it for all users in the terminal service environment, the application that drove us to remote computing in the first place actually is one of those. We use a point of sales application that will go nameless, but essentially we need to be able to access this from multiple physical sites. The particular implementation of the software that they happen to have doesn't do multiple databases very well. If you make a change in one of your branch sites, it will not necessarily replicate back to the main site properly, and you get all sorts of accounting errors. So after running for a few years with the very broken implementation of multiple databases, we went back to the software vendor and said, okay, so what do you guys recommend for this? They said terminal services. So we tried terminal services, but unfortunately the application isn't the most stable thing in the world. And throughout our testing, when one user would crash the application, which happens with alarming frequency, they would manage to crash it for all of the other users on the terminal server. So that didn't even last past the beta phase, and we figured, well, the only other way out of this is virtualization. Now, we thought long and hard about this because at the time, really, there was buying VMware, the licenses for which were completely out of our price range. There was going and changing our point of sales and accounting software over to something else, which would have been a project lasting somewhere in the range of 8 months and probably costing, again, way more than we had available. Or we could take Microsoft's Virtual Server 2005, which was bad. Very, very bad. But it did the job. And it was a pain in the butt, but we got through it. They came out with a new version, an R2, that cleaned up a lot of the problems, and eventually came out with Hyper-V. Now, Hyper-V was a lot better, but migrating from our existing Microsoft virtual machines into Hyper-V wasn't exactly going to be the easiest thing in the world. So we re-examined everything, and at that time we came up with VMware's ESXi Free as being way easier to use. So we moved to that. But it has been an evolutionary process driven by need. It was never really something that we just decided, well, this is kind of cool and this is something that we should try out. We were kind of backed into a corner at every point.
So that's a really good example of how real-world problems can get in the way of the best laid plans when it comes to desktop virtualization and force you to change your designs. Thank you for that. Finish up by talking to us about some of the other challenges that you might face when putting together, in particular, a VDI solution.
Well, I think one of the things to really bear in mind with VDI that is a bit of a change from more traditional systems. When you get into the realm of VDI, software is going to be far, far more of your budget than the hardware is. And I'm sure that makes all sorts of hardware vendors very upset, but the reality of it is modern servers, modern computers are fast enough to deal with tens, dozens, potentially hundreds of individual desktops on a single server. You can even look at fault-tolerant servers from a company like Stratus that will provide you with a single system capable of doing all that you need, that you don't have to have set up in high availability. You don't have to have all the rest of this stuff, or you can go for small, highly available clusters. And the hardware costs will still be less than your software costs. You really, really, really have to pay attention to not only the cost of the management software, but the licensing costs and the licensing restrictions that differ between virtualization and physical implementation of the same applications.
So there you have it. VDI is not the only fruit when it comes to desktop virtualization, but if you are forced to eat it, don't forget the hidden costs, including software. Thanks once again to you, Trevor. I hope to have you back soon.
All right.